The centerpiece in this concert is Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, which for quite a lot of people is just about the perfect symphony. In fact, the late critic Clive James, on one occasion, I remember him saying that being a celebrity in the modern world was not an achievement. And he said, if you want to get an idea of what a real achievement is, listen to Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, which is quite a ringing endorsement, isn't it? I'll tell you more about that in a moment, though. First of all, something about the pieces in the first half. The Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov wrote this Russian Easter Festival overture in 1866, and it is spectacularly Russian. Right from the start, he evokes the sound of Russian bells. Now, Russian bells, I don't know if you've heard them, are quite unlike the sound of the bells that we're used to in this country or even on the continent. They don't have pitches. They're not tuned to notes. They're just a kind of high metallic sound, a middle metallic sound, a low metallic sound, and a very deep bass sound, more like a gong. And the way they're played, the higher the sound, the faster it goes. So at the top, you'll get dum tiddlum, 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 and then slightly slower in the middle, and then a very big bong on the bottom. And Rimsky catches that beautifully in the opening of the Easter Festival. But he also has some marvelous examples of Russian church chant, which is played on various instruments, and particularly on the brass, who do sound like a big chorus. Russian chant isn't quite like the kind of chant we're used to in the Western church. Plain song, for instance, which is very popular. It doesn't float in the same way. It's much starker and deeper and richer. And immediately, I think you'll get that sense of this flavor from this music. If there's a piece that just says from the very beginning, Russia, this is it. And Easter is particularly important in the Russian church, almost more important than Christmas. The image of Christ being born again, people hand candles to each other at the midnight vigil and say, Christ is born again, Christ is risen. It's a very big event in a way that Easter isn't quite in our country. So again, something of that extraordinarily festive quality of life and light returning. And that's probably got something to do with the fact that the Russian winter is particularly long and dark. So just as you're entering spring and the sun is coming back and you're beginning to see the first signs of greenery appearing, it has an immense charge, this idea that life is returning all over again. After that, we have the third and final violin concerto by Saint-Saëns. I'm really pleased to see what's been happening to Saint-Saëns recently. Even when I was a kid, he was starting to go out of fashion and people were beginning to be rather sneery about him. Yes, yes, he's very entertaining. Yes, yes, he's very good at tunes, but he's not really deeply serious composer and wasn't an innovator in his own time. Well, that's actually worth discussing sometime. But actually, Saint-Saëns, there's so much more to him than a kind of superficial entertainment monger. There's real depth in his music, and there's something about the exquisiteness that he crafts it that at times I think is almost reminiscent of Mozart. This violin concerto is a very, very good example. The first two violin concertos that Saint-Saëns wrote are very much virtuoso pieces. They're full of exciting technical challenges. They're very exciting to watch. There's nothing better than seeing a violin struggling with his instrument on the stage and still, however, managing to produce marvelous sounds. But the third concerto, which Saint-Saëns wrote for a very famous virtuoso of his time called Pablo De Santi, is a rather different piece. It's not so much about show-off fireworks. It's about melody. It's about the soul of the violin. You know, we're not seeing the violin as an athlete here. We're hearing the violin as a poet. And I think that that's really important. And this is interesting that it was the most popular of his violin concertos in his own lifetime. And it's interesting that violinists are beginning to pick it up again and again today. I'm really pleased to see that because this is a piece with heart. And I think it's the heart, not just of Saint-Saëns, but the heart of the violin that's speaking to us here. I am delighted to see that Aylen Pritchin is one of many young violinists who is taking this piece up again. I don't think I need to say much more. It's so enjoyable and it's so easy to understand on first hearing. And we shouldn't be snobbish about that. That's not a sign that it isn't good. After all, the same could be said about Mozart, couldn't it? And then finally, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. Beethoven wrote this at a rather interesting period of his life in 1811. You have to remember that at the time, Europe was in a state of real devastation and confusion. Napoleonic wars had been going on for years. Napoleon had been pushing backwards and forwards, annexing countries, extending his empires. The following year, of course, he would try disastrously to conquer Russia, where he was beaten not so much by the Russian armies, but by winter, which is the thing that always seems to come to the Russians' defense in the end. There was a place, a spa town in what is now Czechoslovakia, that was then called Teplitz, which was considered to be neutral territory, and dignitaries and diplomats from either side of the conflict used to meet there as it was safe. Beethoven went there, however, for the good of his health. Beethoven struggled with so much bad health throughout his life. It wasn't just his famous deafness. He was troubled with all sorts of terrible ailments, physical ailments, cramps, stomach cramps, indigestion, muscular spasms, tinnitus, ringing in the ears was something that bothered him too, particularly as his deafness got worse. And he was very prone to depression. Well, not surprisingly, you might say, having to struggle with all that kind of thing. So he went to Teplitz for a rest cure, as it used to be called. And it really obviously did him good, because he came back bursting with ideas, sketches for 3 symphonies, one of which 12 years later was to turn out to be the famous choral 9th. But the first one he worked on is the 7th. And it has an amazing quality of, well, Berlioz called one of his pieces Return to Life. I think it would do even better as a title for Beethoven's 7th Symphony. There's something about stepping out into the sunlight after a long darkness and just really thinking, wow, isn't it marvelous how the sun can transform a landscape and a life in the process. Wagner famously called this symphony the apotheosis of the dance. Now, I think he was onto something there. Beethoven had a remarkably strong sense of rhythm. Now, that's interesting because rhythm is not the quality that tends to stand out on the whole in German music, or at least not in German music in the 19th century. And some people have inferred, as many did in his own lifetime, that in Beethoven's Flemish background, there must have been a Spanish influence. That accounted for his complexion and his very, very dark hair. And also, how else would you account for this astonishing sense of dancing rhythm that he has? In the 7th Symphony, it runs like a kind of thread throughout the whole piece. There's a sort of rhythm, da, 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 that goes all the way through. It's there, for instance, in the very popular slow movement, the second movement, which seems to be based on a theme which is just one note repeated. And so it goes on like that. But even in that relatively slow music, you can sense a kind of dance step, can't you? You can imagine moving to it. It's not like your typical relaxed slow movement. It's much more about movement. And throughout the rest of the symphony, that da, da, da rhythm it just keeps popping up. In the first theme, da-dum, da, da-dum, da, da-dum, da, from the first movement. In the scherzo, da, da-dum, da, da-dum, this figure keeps turning up again and again. And in the finale, it becomes an incredible, almost furious dance tune. Dum, dum, dum. It's obsessive in an incredibly sort of frightening and exciting way at the same time, almost as though Beethoven is just determined to dance darkness out of his system. He does something quite interesting as well. Now, I know that when people like me talk about tonality, people's eyes tend to glaze over because it sounds so abstract, but I think tonality is something we all respond to even if we don't know we are. I think it's very much part of the emotional fabric of music, even if we can't put a name to it. The symphony is in a very bright key of A major. But very early on, there's a tendency to drag down towards a darker key of F. And all the way through the symphony, you can sense F, as it were, trying to pull Beethoven back from sunlight rejoicing into something gloomier, perhaps more introspective. And it's the finale that decides, right, I am going to dance this out of my system. And towards the end of the finale, you'll hear that the bass starts falling very slowly by degrees. Until it falls to F. There we are on F. has F1, but then it falls once more to, and we're back to A major. And the last crescendo of this symphony is a colossal build-up on A, to the point where at the climax, Beethoven actually does something that has never been done in orchestral music before. The loudest dynamic that you could come across in classical music up till then was FF, fortissimo, which means as loud as possible. And even that was used pretty sparingly till Beethoven's time. Beethoven asks for FFF, fortissimo, louder than as loud as possible. And there's something about that, those two great waves that end in FFF, where it's as though Beethoven is just saying, well, I love what the conductor Simon Rattle says. There are times when you look at Beethoven's manuscripts and see how he's written things, and you realize he just wants you to drive this bus off a cliff. And that's the feeling at the end of it. Drive and dance this darkness out of your system. And I think that's one of the things that makes this symphony so wonderful. I've known it since I was about 5. And I still find it incredibly thrilling. It just never goes stale. It's so fresh. It's so full of, you sense what it was inside Beethoven that always kept him going. And that's one reason why, even though it's well over 200 years old, it's still, in a sense, absolutely contemporary, because who doesn't need that kind of message now?